So I've been thinking a lot about this metagelical term and what it's doing, what it is seeking to describe. And I think that it's a useful term because there is a something that's difficult to describe because it's centering around a group of people with similar goals, interests. It's a large container that's holding a bunch of different things that according to previous paradigms we wouldn't hold together, but by the standards of what's going on now in the culture, I think that you can group a whole lot of strange bedfellows together, essentially, within this term of metagelicalism. It said, and I shared a little post on Twitter kind of talking about like why I think Wesley Huff, being a fairly standard Christian apologetics kind of guy, does fit in that category alongside the Petersons and the Pageaus and a lot of other characters. And so in the way that I was formulating it, I think it's a useful category since we're just making it up anyways. There is no definition. But for me and my purposes, it's something where I say, okay, well, I don't have to worry about using like the term the church, because I say not everybody that is metagelical is in the church. As an example, I'd like to say, Malcolm and Simone. It's like, wow, there's a lot of things that I would agree with them on.
So there's something weird going on with penises and vaginas specifically.
They're trying to make their own religion, so obviously they're not Christian, even though they continually seem to be moving in a direction with their understanding of the Bible that's much like Joe Rogan, more and more affirming of what's in there, and that it does make sense, and it makes sense more in this big picture way when you stop always trying to pick apart all the little details and criticize it and kind of let it do its thing. And so this makes me, wonder in another sense, what are the other groups or whatever that fit into it? And it's to say, it's not necessarily that groups fit in. It's probably more accurate to say that certain people from many groups fit in within it, or certain subcultures of groups fit in. So like I would say, there's a certain aspect of the evangelical church that immediately grasps the value of what happened with that Wes Huff interview, and somebody like Dallas Jenkins, who's really grasped the value in what Jordan Peterson's doing, and they're not abandoning their paradigms to do that. They're willing to have a conversation in terminology that the other person is comfortable with, to try to build a bridge, which I think is part of what this whole thing is about. And so the interesting question is, like, where do the Mormons fit in here? Because the Mormons are such a big part of American culture, for sure. They have a huge influence in a lot of ways. And, so as I've been thinking about it, and like, on the one hand, so as an evangelical who's fairly well versed in a lot of the apologetics, you get a lot of, there's a million evangelical apologetics resources exposing the flaws of Mormonism. Like that's you can watch that stuff all day long on YouTube. Like James White's done a lot of that, and many others. And so obviously within the paradigm where apologetics is like, within that modernist frame where it's just always about the mutually exclusive truth claims, well, yeah, evangelicals and Mormons can't really work together. But in another level, I'd say, okay, well, they've been comfortable working together on a level of something like conservative politics, pro-life, pro-family. You have wariness. It's interesting, like the first few seasons of The Chosen were filmed on a set that was built by the LDS Church. Dallas Jenkins has got a lot of flack from evangelicals with his involvement with Mormon production companies and things like that. So, and the pushback that he's given is, and I think he said places like they are worshiping the same Jesus or something like that, and that's made a lot of the concerned trolls really upset. But I have been most familiarized with actual Mormons, or not that I know personally, but through like the fantasy literature market. And so I saw this discussion that is exactly something I've been contemplating many times, which is why are there so many Mormons in the fantasy and science fiction space? And I, on the kind of like wisecrack meme level, my first thought of thinking about it for a minute was like, well, obviously, because the Book of Mormon is fiction, so it makes sense that people that believe in it would be good at writing fiction. And like you can say that in a joking sort of way, but I do think that it's actually a sort of profoundly true answer. And so this was an interesting podcast. Listen to the girl, and she said like a lot of Mormon kids, like she grew up with Chronicles of Narnia, and so we were like, oh well, Chronicles of Narnia. C.S. Lewis is already a meta world building author, because he has the wood between the worlds, and it's not exactly the same as like the coming at the multiverse from a materialist viewpoint, because you have the serious scientists or philosophers that talk about the multiverse usually are using it as a response to the fine-tuning problem, and so they're wanting there to be billions and billions of completely absurd universes that don't have any life, so that ours can then become a statistical anomaly, and that's why we exist. That's not very interesting, but what Lewis does certainly is, and those ideas have propagated the fantasy realm, and so it's really interesting. So I'm going to play the clip here where she talks about Brandon Sanderson with his faith, and what's interesting to me is that it's interesting because, even in the comments of the video, one person was saying that they noticed Brandon wrestling with ideas about faith in his books that they wrestled with as like a Southern Baptist, and they deconstructed or whatever. And the woman that's speaking, she's an urban monoculture convert from Mormonism. She left Mormonism. She's in the urban monoculture. So, there's a lot of presumptions about certain obvious truths that comes with that. But what she highlights about Sanderson and what he says is very interesting, because it's like, well, it really reflects a lot of, I could say, my own experience in saying like, well, I have maybe a different set of problems, but like, okay, yes, there are problems with church, or like with the evangelical world, but like, I think it's true. I have experiences. The culture works. The people are good. So, it's very interesting to say like, okay, well, based on everything that he says, it doesn't seem like a modernist argument about the propositions and the mutually exclusive truth claims would be convincing enough for him to leave Mormonism for, what we would say traditional Christianity. And in a metagelical sense, I would have to say, like, I wouldn't want someone to do that just because of an apologetics argument, if it means betraying the goodness of those other things, and obviously this is a question that some people have no problem just accepting it as a given, that like what, oh yeah, his experiences are real and what he's saying is real. Other people will want to say it's like demons. I don't know. I'm not so convinced. I mean, so I say, like, look at the fruit of what he's trying to do, and maybe he's, the things that are his bugaboos are more in line with like a boomerality worldview or whatever. But it was just a very interesting thing to wrestle with. So I'll play that clip.
Brandon Sanderson is a ultra prolific writer. He's written tons of books. Sometimes people say he writes books faster than they can read books. They just get behind because he turns out so many books all the time that it's almost impossible to keep up, because most people don't have 24/7 to devote to reading the multitude of words he writes. He's most known for the Mistborn series and the Stormlight Archive, among many others, as I said. As I was doing my research, I found it interesting that in 2010, he was at a conference, and the conference topic at 10 a.m. in 2010 was, "Why Mormons in Fantasy?" The topic of this video. There seems to be an explosion of young, successful LDS writers in the fantasy field. What are the ingredients in their Mormon background that make this genre a natural fit? So that's the funny thing when people ask questions like this, why Mormons in fantasy, is that it's not even necessarily a secret. It's not even something that people within the community are shocked by. There's an entire conference session dedicated to this question, even back in 2010, which was almost 15 years ago. So I did find that interesting. And also Brandon Sanderson he's very involved with BYU. He teaches at BYU. He's on panels during conferences at BYU. And so he is very tied in with the community over there and very involved in helping young writers come up through BYU and hopefully find success of their own. Here is the cover of the Brandon Sanderson article that was on LDS Living, which is of course a Mormon magazine. I'll link this article below. Obviously, if you're on the cover of a Mormon magazine, you are pretty Mormon. Teaching at BYU, this means that Brandon Sanderson has also achieved the highest level of Mormonism. He wears garments, he is endowed in the temple. From my understanding, to be a member and to teach at BYU, you need to have a temple recommend, just like I had to have a temple recommend as part of attending BYU. And so that means he is, like Stephanie Meyer likely is, he is kind of certifiably the highest level of Mormon. He's done the endowment ceremony. He is all in. I've been planning this video for a long time, which many of you know because I've mentioned it in comments, but 8 days ago, perfectly on time, there was a Reddit thread on r/Mormon just totally dedicated to Brandon Sanderson and his relationship with Mormonism. And I'll link that below too. It looks like this. Somebody said, "The number of times I've sat up and said, that's an interesting observation you've made about gender, Brandon Sanderson." And then the response is, "Me seeing Brandon Sanderson, a Mormon, continually revisiting themes in his fantasy novels of characters breaking free from conservative religious doctrines, breaking down religious mythology, and literally overthrowing gods." And so as someone who didn't grow up reading a ton of Brandon Sanderson, I felt that thread was the perfect synopsis of how people view his Mormonism, which is kind of that because Mormonism is convenient and because it is the culture he's in, he kind of might as well continue in it. I will say, unlike Orson Scott Card, who we are getting to, Brandon Sanderson is widely remarked as a kind person, even within, ex-Mormon circles, never Mormon circles. For everything I can tell about him online, he is a very well-liked individual. People love his books. He's kind, and, if they meet him in person, all of the accounts were very positive. Most people, though, say it is very unlikely that he will leave, and from my research on him, I would concur. And I found, using this Reddit thread, a clip of him answering a really interesting question while he was signing books. Let's watch the clip together.
Radis says, "How do you feel about the fact that queer people are treated better in your novels than on the campus you teach at?" And with a follow-up question, "How do you reconcile donating to a church that promotes purity culture, homophobia, and anti-Semitism with writing books for the general public?"
That is an interesting question. The church's general perspective on LGBTQ people is not where I, as a liberal member of the church, would necessarily want it to be. That said, I have faith in the church. I have had spiritual experiences confirming to me that this is where God wants me and that God is real. There is a scripture in the Book of Mormon where a person is asked a question that they cannot answer. And they just say, I don't know the meaning of all things, but I know God loves his children. I take that perspective.
He does go on and continues answering the question, but I feel like that is essentially his answer in a nutshell.
The other clip that I pulled from a little later on is interesting because this is kind of looking at this aspect of, it's not necessarily that you would put groups of people into this metagelical container, but that you would put some people from a lot of groups into this container, where the host talks about her experience.
The thing about Orson Scott Card getting so much hate for his homophobia is that he is merely saying the line that is kind of held by the church, which is that being gay is a sin and you should repent if you're gay. I think that Orson Scott Card's willingness to just come out and say it is interesting purely because he's not being more bigoted than your average Mormon who believes the doctrine of the church. He's just saying it more loudly and with a bigger microphone because of his audience. And so I think that when I read accounts of Orson Scott Card, he's great-grandson of Brigham Young, his heavy involvement with the church, the Orson Scott Card version of Mormonism is my version of Mormonism I was raised in. The Brandon Sanderson version, I didn't even really know anyone like that growing up that had that version of Mormonism. I had the hellfire and damnation, doctrinal, hearkening back to prophets of old. That was the version of Mormonism that I was raised in, and I very much see reflected in many of the writings. Orson Scott Card has written a lot, not just about gay people, but about the government, about conservatism. In much of what he says, I see the version of the church that I was raised in heavily reflected in what he has to say.
Many such stories also exist in the evangelical world with the deconstruction stories. So that's an interesting dynamic to see that the same dynamics are taking place in these other containers. So when it comes to why does someone like Wes Hupf fit in the metagelical frame, he's doing work that is critical textual analysis. It's a product of modernity. But the problem with modernity, this is what I said on Twitter, is that it has these power structures, and it basically, it claims to rely on things like reason and evidence and empiricism, but then as institutional power grows, and expertise becomes a shortcut that we can rely on, then things are prone to corruption. And so then what you have is a consensus view, and those who differ from it are silenced. And this is not just to say within biblical scholarship. It happens in many fields. It happens in science. It happens in political theory, economics, history, and other forms of academia, and it certainly does happen with biblical scholarship. So with biblical scholarship, it's where to say Bart Ehrman is the consensus view, and he says that we can't trust any of this stuff or whatever, or just the viewpoint that we should be as critical as we want, and it's okay, so Wes is just representing part of that small minority that's pushed back against the mainstream consensus within his field for a long, long time. He's not appealing to meta-modernism as a reason for people to believe in God. He's using the same modern things that somebody like Sean McDowell would point to. He's the academic that specializes in that field, and that's who a more pop level apologist would point to. He's just similar to Michael Heiser or something. It's he acknowledges the reality of the difficult questions, but he's not convinced that those are reasons why we shouldn't have faith in God, because the evidence on the whole to him is convincing, and as it is to many other believers. So why would that guy be a part of this whole metagelical thing? Well, it's because the metagelical thing is okay. So those let's say those magisterial authorities have been removed through postmodernism. This is the effect, what happens, with the postmodern critique of power structures. The consensus view is not, it's lost. Mainstream media has lost to the internet. It's happened in the political realm. That's kind of what the victory of Donald Trump signifies in some sense. The institutional power has lost its control, which means that there's a whole lot of potential options out there. So if you watch Joe Rogan, he platforms all sorts of people. He's got what's his name, Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock, and they're kind of doing their new interpretation of history and archaeology that was called like pseudoscience or pseudo history. He's got Peterson on there. He's got people that are skeptical of the medical industry. He's basically saying, okay, let's forget these consensus fact checker authorities. Let's just let the people speak. And so he lets all the people speak. And so one of the people he lets speak is this guy, Billy Carson. And Billy Carson peddles like a real snake oily kind of version of this stuff. Honestly, I don't even really know too much about him, but from even just seeing what he does in that one interview and talking to other people, it's like Billy Carson can only thrive and be successful because he is operating within the postmodern framework. He would never be able to be taken seriously as an academic in the former structures. But because those former structures have weakened, he's somebody who's able to build a platform. But then when you put somebody who would have been silenced for being a conservative voice within his field before, Wes Huff, up against Billy Carson, he destroys him because he's far more compelling. He has a much better case. And so the example I kind of came up with is if you have like traditionalism, modernity, and postmodernity, it's like rock, paper, scissors. And, good luck trying to build a worldview with only one of those when the other ones exist, and that's the thing. Like, postmodernism destroys modernity, but modernity destroys traditionalism. And then you have Brandon Graham Dempsey's complaint was that people were skipping over modernism and going from postmodernism to tradition. But that was really a very valid move in a functional sense, because it's like postmodernism says there's no meaning, and life is absurd, but you can do whatever you want. And that was supposed to be, you can do whatever you want. So go and, try to stick your thing in every different type of hole and have fun seeing what happens. But you could also use that freedom afforded to you by postmodernism to join a traditional church and live a traditional lifestyle. And yeah, maybe there's a little bit of a LARP aspect to it, but it's working, and once you live in it for a while, it becomes more real, essentially. So that's how a guy like Wes Huff fits in there. But then it's like, well, how does a guy like Brandon Sanderson fit in there? And I think that, Mormonism is really interesting because it is born in modernity, and it escapes a lot of the problems of modernity's critiques of religion, because there is no questions about like when was the Book of Mormon written and who wrote it. Well, we know who wrote it, and we know when it came out or whatever, and we know when the church started, and we know who the people in charge were. Now, it's not to say there's not some controversy, And obviously people have to believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet in order to take advantage of those truth claims. But if you're willing to do that, they have a better answer to some of those critiques of modernity than the Bible scholars do, or whatever. But at the same time, because it's a Christian bolt-on religion, they are also getting the benefit of that history, and in some sense, their whole theological shtick is a correction to some of those critiques of modernity. Like, oh yes, things have been lost, things have been corrupted, but that's why we needed a new prophet and a new revelation. I think it's probably, like, we look at people who don't believe, like, that must have been pretty compelling obviously it was compelling to a lot of people in that day. And I think that if we look at the time frame, where people were, that was the time when people were suffering from a spell of disenchantment, I guess you could say. People were longing for something. That's why, towards the end of that 19th century, you have all this interest in, like, the occult, in psychics and seances and things like that. And Mormonism was a religion that was primed to take advantage of that. Now, when you fast forward 150, 200 years, or whatever, 175 years, and you have a guy like Brandon Sanderson who has a good life in Mormonism, being raised that way, and it works and it functions, but he's got to figure out, like, why, like it's not to say maybe he's never wrestled with. I think he has wrestled with some of the doubts that critics levy against Mormonism about, like, is Joseph Smith a fraud? Because obviously his claims have not withstood the test of time. Once people were able to analyze, like, the places that he was taking things from, and the whole fruits of what came of it, the corruption of polygamy. Then you have somebody who says, like, okay, well, what does Brandon do? He spends all his time writing about the possible ways in which a universe could work together. And his whole project is this Cosmere thing, where he has these different series, which essentially take place on different planets, and each planet has its own kind of system of how things go. But then there's this bigger universe in which they are all connected and they all interact with each other. And it seems like, in a sense, he's very going to be very comfortable with the idea of, how can I be a Mormon and live in a world that does have pluralism and has other people that are very similar in a lot of ways with what they say, which is, to say, like, other Christians, and yet we, so it's almost as if to say, in his world, we're on different planets, but we're within the same universe. And like in Lewis's world, it would be that we are in these different doors of the wood between the worlds. Okay, I'm going to finish up this video. It's the next day. There was lots of good discussion about some of these things in other ways. Thinking about, like, Mel Gibson, he's Catholic, but he's made so many movies that are really meaningful to a lot of other people. And I think there's something about, there's definitely a doctrinal thing where Christians Protestants and evangelicals are more open now to affirming that Catholics and Orthodox are also Christians, because, like, we agree on the Trinity and we agree on some of these other points that we consider to be foundational, whereas that's a line of distinction between us and the Mormons. But I think if there's one thing to note, not all Mormons are created equal. You can kind of see that from the video, Orson Scott Card versus Brandon Sanderson. And there's a generational thing too. You got a boomer and a millennial, I guess, or an Xer. I think he's probably an Xer. And what's going on there. And my thought is that if this streak of fictional prowess that comes out of the Mormon Church, perhaps if we see that as a powerful sense-making tool, which I think we should easily admit that is there when it comes to people like Lewis and Tolkien. The use of fiction is so powerful in helping to translate these hard to grasp things that, or maybe things that can be so dry when we express them as doctrinal issues. And I like Brandon Sanderson's fiction, and I think that there are definitely some themes that are more universal than the particulars of Mormonism, and so that's a reason to engage. It's not like and I would say even there is a quality there that is different from when you read fiction that's written by an atheist, and especially someone who's nihilistic. The core of the good is there. And so if metagelical, is to take a meta-modern epistemology and apply it to, the evangelion, that's the gospel, the good news, the focus is on the good. Because somehow evangelicalism really turned into like a code word for conversionism. And I don't know why that is. That's not really what it's about. Where people were even complaining that Wes Huff didn't tell Joe that he's a sinner enough, and they didn't explain like this certain mechanism of repentance in the right way, or he kind of did talk about that. I don't know why people were upset about it, because he was speaking good news, and he was speaking it in a way that Joe was very interested to hear it. And so I would say there's definitely a lot of good news that Brandon Sanderson has picked up on through his Mormon upbringing and the Mormon Church, and that good news has been translated into his books. And I can't think of many. It's a fictional world. It's not like Lewis with the lion is Jesus. It's more like Tolkien, where you have to look at the themes of the things and the way things work together. And in that regard, I think that his fiction has a lot of truth in it and a lot of goodness. And there's certainly many, many people who are fans of his work that we could talk to about it. So I decided to add one more thing to this video. So after I had started working on it, I went on X and saw a long thread where someone was complaining about Brandon Sanderson's descend into wokeness. And obviously the clip that lady highlighted talked about him being a liberal. He was talking about him being a liberal person within the church, and that he's very affirming of LGBTQ. And so the controversy is, I haven't read his newest book. They're really long books. It's been a while since I read the rest of the series, so I don't know if I want to go through the whole thing to catch up or just listen to the audiobook at some point. But from what I've heard, and this person was highlighting in a thread that he's had an increase in representation within his novels. And I saw somebody say somewhere else, and this is, conservative people complaining about him being woke or whatever, saying that having representation is not that to not have it, to rid your stories, I guess, of these characters would be that would be the fantasy. And essentially that is a conservative fantasy, essentially, that you want to write a book and you don't want to include any of these things, which is fine for there's none of that in Lord of the Rings, despite people trying to reinterpret things that way. But I think that, what he said is true. If you're trying to make your fantasy world reflect the world that we actually live in, which is probably important for a modern reader, for a contemporary reader, it, at least to some degree, it's important to acknowledge the presence of those things. And I've heard, and from what I understand, this comes, in concert with increasing pressures from publishers, especially because he's so mainstream. He's the mainstream book publishing world is right along with all what the mainstream media has been. And so, he's gone from a more conservative to a more liberal position on this issue. But if he's still committed to staying within his church, like the woman who made the commentary video, she probably would love to see him denounce the church because of his desire to move in this direction on this affirming issue. But what I would say is that if Brandon is going to wrestle with these things, and I think that there is something beyond the conservatives are not affirming and the liberals are affirming. I think that we're moving through this issue in a way. And I think if you look at somebody like Malcolm and Simone on their channel, they had a thing about how the ideological movement that's gone beyond representation to having the correct take on these things is so detrimental for the story aspects. They were talking particularly in video games. They were talking about a recently released Dragon Age game where, it was like the main character, the main storyline or some part of the main story is basically like this person's transgender journey. And that's what you're playing a role-playing game to live out, is that instead of, fighting dragons and saving the world. And so, and the response to that has been that the sales have plummeted. So I think that it's an interesting dichotomy where you have somebody like Brandon Sanderson, who in the publishing realm is in the current moment, but as a Mormon living in Utah, that whole place is sort of behind the times. And, it's interesting how there is a lot of turmoil within their community, probably not unlike those who followed Paul Vanderklay's discussion of the CRC, the difference between what's going on in Grand Rapids, the very urban elite part of the urban monoculture, versus the more rural suburban parts of the church, that there's a totally disconnected set of values. And basically, I think that overall, it's not that we've gone from conservative to liberal back to conservative. I think that many of the people you see, especially the people who were mainstream media that have come into this conservative space, they're not just flip-flopping on things. They're what's happening is that they're experiencing a limit to how far you can go with these other ideas. And so what I would say is that for Brandon to come to a clearer point on this, especially as an author, the way that he's going to do it is through the writing of his fiction. So his Stormlight Archive is supposed to be, I think, 10 books, and this is, I think it's 10, and he's just released number 5, and there's supposed to be like a big break, and he's going to work on other projects, and then he's going to resume this series. It may be that this book, which I haven't read yet, is the high watermark, or maybe the next one or something would be the high watermark of LGBT inclusion and representation. And then as the culture moves past, which really, the big elephant in the room is that it needs to be addressed, how young people are shaped by the influence of these stories and representation. In which case, he becomes somebody who is not only just a neutral party in this, but he's somebody who is actively forming people's opinions on these things, young people who are wrestling with these things. It may be that he's simply affected by a huge drop in sales or something, or he may wrestle through these things. But I would say that the way he's going to wrestle through it is through writing it, because he's going to deal with these problems in his fantasy world and then come to terms with them as a reflection of how they fit in the real world. And that's the only way that it's going to go. That's the best way that it's going to go. And it's really one of the powerful things that fiction can do, which is why we should read fiction, write fiction, and not shy away from people who are willing to be bold and wrong and question these things and let them play out. Because ultimately, if we can come to understand a disastrous outcome in fiction, perhaps we don't have to go through it in real life to the same degree. So that is my closing thought on this issue. Thank you.